I am building all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft, and after 2.5 years of this project, I'm still going. So far, we've finished about 75% of the map, and today, we come dangerously close to finishing the project. We're first going to build up Akkala, which includes locations like the Zonai Labyrinth and fan favorite Tarrey Town. Because Akkala is so small, we're also going to tackle the Eldin region, with builds like Goron City and the final divine beast of the series. This means that in the next episode, we close in from all sides on Central Hyrule, building Hyrule Castle, and finishing the project. But for now, we have a different castle to build up. Guarding the northeastern seas of Hyrule is Akkala Citadel, our first stop for today. Connecting the path from Zora's domain to the Citadel, I started with this large bridge leading up to the castle. I had spent the last couple months working on my Attack on Titan video, so this was a simple, very enjoyable way to get back into the project. There were also some ruins on the path right above the bridge that I quickly fixed up. Closer to the Citadel, Goat was working on another bridge, but it was so destroyed that it was almost entirely missing. As she finished up the bridge, I came in to add the Guardian that was hanging off of the edge. But before we start working on the Citadel itself, there are a couple things we need to figure out first. To start, we need some new trees. Most of the trees in Akkala have orange and yellow leaves, and there sadly aren't any leaves in Minecraft that fit this color. So we had to settle for non-leaf blocks to make up the trees. Ombrains and Voxel worked together to design them, and they ended up working quite well. I wasn't sure if the trees would work out with non-leaf blocks, but I think they do. Akkala also has a reddish rock color instead of the regular gray stone, so we had to come up with a new block palette to fit the region. Because I'm colorblind, it was tricky to figure out the correct palette on my own, but we got it figured out after Voxel and Ombrains came to help. Now, with these steps figured out, we can start building the Citadel itself. Voxel and I started with this battlement on the outer end of the castle, and as it turns out, pretty much the entire Citadel is made up of this same battlement over and over again. So with this structure complete, most of the Citadel was just done. Before we put the rest of the Citadel into place, however, I finished up the staircase that wraps around the backside of the mountain, which took no time at all. It was just a little bit tedious to build up. With the help of Voxel and Sam, we started building up the main entrance to the castle. As it turns out, this was just a slightly edited version of the Great Plateau's main entrance. We did have to rotate it slightly to fit the angle of the mountain, but it didn't take too long to fix that up. With the main entrance complete, I finally began to place all of the battlements around the mountain, with Voxel there to help clean it all up. The main Citadel was now complete. All that was left was the top side around the Sheikah Tower. The tower was surrounded by a cluster of smaller ruins, and by this point, I'm really used to building these kinds of ruins, so they weren't too bad at all. Ombrains, Goat, and Voxel were there to help out as well, and soon enough, we were draping the pools of malice over the mountain to finish off Akkala Citadel. Moving on through Akkala, our next major stop is Tarrey Town, so I decided to build along this road heading east until we made it to the town. As I made my way towards the Tingle Islands, it began to sink in for me that this was the beginning of the end. We were approaching the final labyrinth, the final divine beast, and the final 2 settlements of the world. This was the first time that the end of the project felt close. We began working on the Tingle Islands, and a sense of finality was beginning to set in. Every completed build, no matter how small, felt like a huge step forward. And being right next to Lanayru, one of the first regions we built, invoked a feeling of nostalgia as I reflected on the project. This project has had a constant presence in my life for so long, and now, the idea that it was nearly done felt almost sad. I didn't even realize until we were starting on Tarrey Town that this was the final Hylian settlement we had left to build. I began by editing the terrain of the island slightly to give more room for Tarrey Town, and outlined where all of the buildings would go with help from Voxel, Ombrains, and Skeil. The different angles for each house made it tricky to find the right dimensions for the structures, and since each Tarrey Town home is composed of large cubes, I knew it was going to be tricky to work with these angles. Sly and Ombrains jumped on later to help design the buildings, and we were able to knock all of them out at once. The designs themselves were all very simple, since they were pretty much just multicolored boxes. It just took some time to mold them into the correct angles. Since the others had already made the center fountain earlier, Tarrey Town was mostly complete. Goat and Ombrains took on the task of the interiors, and since the town is so small, all that was left were the final details, which I finished putting in place. Because of how simple Tarrey Town is, it went by extremely fast, but despite how small of a build it is, I think it turned out quite nice. There was still work to do in southern Akkala, however. I finished up the stable beneath the Citadel and added in some of the nearby forests. I also had to add some guardians and some small ruins to the swampy region behind Tarrey Town. I finished up the Rift Peninsula, which just had some small ruins and a shrine. Most of the work here was just prettying up the terrain. Further north, however, I finished up the quarry outside the Spring of Power, which was very straightforward and had the rare Skywatcher Guardians to add in. For the Spring of Power itself, I had to terraform the pocket that it sits in to make room for the build. Afterwards, Voxel joined in to help add in the details and finish up the spring. Akkala was absolutely flying by, mostly because the region was small and so were the builds in the area. Being in the final stretch of the project was a huge boost of motivation for me, and for the first time in months, I was really enjoying the map again. But with Eldin looming above me so close by, I was getting a little worried. Because for pretty much the entire project, Eldin had been the region I was looking forward to the least. Eldin covers a huge part of the map, and is scattered with massive rocks that I would have to terraform myself. For the longest time, large terraforming tasks had been my least favorite work on the map, and that's not all. For months, I had known that Rudania was going to be the most difficult divine beast by far. I was going to have to build the beast walking diagonally across the volcano. Eldin was akin to the final boss of the project, and with Akkala being so close to completion, I was soon going to have to face it. But I still have to finish up northern Akkala first. I tackled Skull Lake next, which didn't have much to it apart from some terraforming. The block palette of the rocks here are the same as the Breach of Demise from the last episode. So once the terraforming was finished, I painted the cliffs with the same color. Now let's work on Akkala Ancient Tech Lab. I started with a cylindrical stone brick base for the tech lab, adding in the foundations for the rickety floors above. The tech lab has a lot of smaller structures around the backside, so I built those up next, using some designs that Skeil had already whipped up earlier. After finishing the crane with a guardian and the windmill around the other side, I outlined the structure for the massive telescope. With the basic outline for the entire lab built up, Voxel helped me add all of the smaller details around the tech lab. The telescope was finished up, the furnace out front was put in place, and we also moved the entire lab over to make room for the guardian pile. We then built up the interior together to finish off the build, including this little design for Cherry the robot. I think its name is Cherry, I don't remember. With northern Akkala finished, the only build left in this area was the Zonai Labyrinth. Skeil and I started by outlining where all of the walls would go, which, just like the last maze we built, was incredibly fun. Something about it always feels like we're putting together a puzzle, and it's super satisfying to see it all connect together at the end. Now, the wall designs for each of the labyrinths are identical, so I reused the same outer walls from the Hebra maze here, only having to edit them slightly to fit the new size. I then swept through the inside of the maze to add the rest of the walls, which was pretty tedious work, and there was a fair bit of cleaning up to do when it was finished. Afterwards, I added in the guardians all around the place, and explored every inch of the maze to add in all of the little details and secrets. With the top side of the maze complete, I moved on to the guardian graveyard below to finish off the labyrinth. I always greatly enjoyed building the labyrinths, so the realization that all of them were complete and I didn't have another one to look forward to was pretty bittersweet. With so much of the map complete, I was running out of builds to look forward to. The end of the project had always felt so far away, but all of a sudden, it was closing in fast. But there was still a major obstacle standing between me and the finale, the Eldin region. Starting with this small area between Lanayru Tower and the volcanic region, there was a lot of terrain cleanup to do. I added in some large rocks that were missing on the map, and this shrine tied to a quest at the nearby stable. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was one of the last remaining stables on the map. I also added in some of the lakes and enemy camps to the area a little further west, but since this path goes up to Korok Forest, I didn't go too far along it. But just like that, I was standing at the Maw of Death Mountain. The most dreaded region of the entire map was finally upon me. Way back in the early days of the project, tasks like the Dueling Peaks and Lanayru Cliffs felt like monumental terraforming jobs that took hours to complete. But none of them came anywhere close to the scale of Eldin. Looking at the volcano as it was a complete disaster. The terrain was a mess with giant holes in the ground and jutting spikes on the edge of cliffs. And the peak of the volcano was even worse. To start, it was way too short, and I mean, just look at this nightmare. But the worst of it all were the dozens and dozens and dozens of jagged overhanging rocks scattered across the mountain. Every single one of them was missing from my map. I had to build all of them myself. I procrastinated by going through Eldin to add all of the lava pools that cover the mountain, but after that, there was nothing left for me to do. I had to bite the bullet and get to the real work. But since the beginning of the project, since those early days where small terraforming tasks seemed like a nightmare, I've learned so much. I've acquired new building tools to make the job faster and easier. After all this time working on the map, it no longer seemed like an impossible task. In fact, now that I was actually here, I felt excited. I had overcome far worse during this project, and this was the last major hurdle standing in my way. With Eldin finished, it would be smooth sailing to the end of the map. This was it. One last major push. Let's get to work. Starting below the Eldin Tower, I began to add in all of the massive spikes using Axiom's rock tool. With Breath of the Wild open on the side, I swept across southern Eldin, replicating each rock to the general size and structure from the game. I moved deeper into the heart of Eldin as I followed the main path, but upon reaching the peak of the volcano, I backtracked to finish up the western edge of Eldin first. There wasn't as much terraforming in this region though. The northern side of the mountain was a lot more sparse with less rocks, so I wrapped around to work on the eastern side far above the now complete region of Akkala. After countless hours and multiple days, most of the terraforming was finally complete. But the work wasn't done yet. Death Mountain itself still remained. To get things moving, I first tried extending the mountain upwards more, but this first attempt was not what I was looking for. It was too smooth and needed to be wider at the top, so I began again. As I finished the second attempt up, it still felt off. There was an issue with the structure of the mountain that I couldn't put my finger on. But as I fixed up the holes and other issues on the volcano, I realized that it was simply too thin at the base of the mountain. So I bulked up the volcano a lot more near the bottom, and it was suddenly looking much better. With the structure of the mountain finished, I marked out the areas in which lava would be flowing down the volcano, making them completely accurate to what they are in Breath of the Wild. And finally, after outlining all of the lava with a darker gray palette, Death Mountain and all of the terraforming in Eldin was finally complete. In the end, the terraforming of Eldin was not nearly as bad as I had always dreaded it being. With the terraforming complete, I was free to go back through the region and add all of the actual builds, like Goron City and Rudania. Let's begin back at the maw of the mountain and move our way up the main path. A lot of the rocks in Eldin have these weird metal structures sticking out of them, so I built some of them up at the entrance of the region. The path this low down didn't have much to it apart from some trees and guardians, so it was going fast at first. There was also a new type of enemy camp that Voxel and I built up that is exclusive to Eldin. This structure appears a few different times around the region. There were some more shrines on the path, but soon enough we were approaching the southern Goron mines. I put together the bridge before completing some small terraforming work, as Voxel helped put in the smaller details. Honestly, I remember these mines having a lot more to them than this, but no, this is pretty much it for the mines. There were some other minor tasks around southern Eldin, such as some hot springs and the Rockrose Shrine area, but other than that, Eldin is extremely empty. There's nothing here. Northern Eldin is a lot more dense, but before we work on that, we have to complete Goron City, the final settlement on the entire map. Unless you count Korok Forest, but I don't. Skeil and Ombrains logged on to help outline Goron City, but there was a lot of fixing up we had to do to the terrain before we started. There were paths missing, the lava was messed up, so I had to spend some time working on all of that. In the meantime, Goat was building up the bridge that acts as the entrance to the city, which is very similar to some of the metal structures we built earlier in Eldin. With all of the buildings outlined, we got to work on the bridges scattered throughout the city. They all had the same, pretty simplistic design, so it didn't really take us too long to get something going. Now, all of the buildings in Goron City are literally just big rocks, so there's hardly any design work that needs to go into them. I created the rock structures while Ombrains and Skeil hollowed them out for interiors. These buildings are practically the same color that the Eldin cliffs are, except they have a more striped look to them. So I recreated a similar idea for the houses here, kinda like what a Badlands biome looks like. Despite the buildings all being rocks, each of them did have some kind of metal infrastructure outside the front, so Skeil and I began work on those, as well as all of the smaller details around the town, like lampposts and guardrails. I was the lucky one who got to build up the infamous big pair of underwear, so yay for me. After most of the buildings were done, I finally worked on the chief's hut, which had a darker black color to it. I used some deep slate and nether brick to achieve this color. Once I added the golden Goron insignia at the top, the city was complete. Or was it? You might have noticed that the giant bridge going over the city is still missing. Well, I haven't built it yet because one of the 3 Goron statues is holding up the bridge. I had to build the Goron statue first to figure out where the bridge was supposed to go. Oh my god, I have to build the Goron statues. For the longest time, this part of the project felt so far away, so I never bothered to even think about how I was going to tackle this. So, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. There are 3 separate Goron statues, so I first got the general structure of each of them down with different colored wool. Etzeo and Skeil were there to help properly shape them, but none of us had any clue what we were doing. We got a decent shape down for the Darmani statue, but it still just wasn't that great. We spent ages working on this one, but we were getting nowhere, so I decided to just move on to the next statue. Whoever this guy is. Goron, apparently. Who knew? To my dismay, however, this one was turning out even worse, no matter how hard I tried to fix the mistakes. So I decided to do what any good builder would. I ditched the statues and hoped that my future self would figure it out. But with the end of the region approaching, I knew that I'd have to figure out something soon. I couldn't procrastinate these forever. For now, I fixed up the path to the North Goron mines, which had some missing lava falls and some guardrails. This was also the first time I came across one of the many cannons spread across the mines and Death Mountain itself, so it was time to finally build one. After building a similar cannon in my Attack on Titan video, I gained some knowledge on how to structure this, so I got it down pretty quickly. The rest of the abandoned mines were just enemy camps and more cannons, so it was pretty much a bunch of copy-pasting. There was also this crab-shaped rock behind the mines, which I finished up pretty fast, before outlining where the railway goes over the lava lake. I used actual rails and minecarts to make these practical, so you can actually use them when the world download releases. I came up with a design for the support beams and placed them evenly across the rail, finishing the abandoned mines. All that's left of Death Mountain is the path to the peak and the flank of Eldin, but this area only has 2 builds, Gut Check Rock and the Eldin Great Skeleton. Let's do the skeleton first. All of the skeletons have generally the same bone structure except for the heads, so I was able to reuse most of the bones from the previous 2. The head became a problem due to its strange shape, and it's very oversized compared to the rest of the body, which ended up making it look pretty weird. It took a bit of time, but I finally figured out how to make the head plating look good, finishing up the Great Skeleton. This means that all 3 of the ancient skeletons are now complete. Moving on to Gut Check Rock, I added in the trees and enemy camps below, and terraformed the monolithic rock since it was a bit too small. The top side reused a lot of the same metal structures that were scattered across Eldin, so after adding those in place, it was pretty much complete. Eldin was coming together way faster than I thought it would, and to be honest, it ended up being one of the most enjoyable parts of the project. Maybe now that the end of the project was so close, I was appreciating each little build a bit more. Maybe it was just more interesting because of how different it was from the rest of the map. Regardless, I was ready to finish the region off. Moving back close to Goron City, I started work on the path to Death Mountain, which Skeil had already started on. There was another minecart rail, some hot springs, and some missing lava pools. The rest of the path is empty until we get to the Bridge of Eldin. The bridge was pretty straightforward, and I'm very glad that I didn't build it when it was still standing, because if I had to build it like this, there would be a lot of difficult design work on the underside. It came together pretty fast, and now I was ready to finish up Death Mountain. I had to perfect the terrain a bit more for the path up the mountain to flow correctly, and I added in all of the cannons and smaller details along the road. I also wanted to build a massive plume of smoke coming out of the mountain, but decided to save that for after Rudania. Speaking of Rudania, there was nothing else to build in Eldin. It was all complete. It was finally time to tackle the final, most difficult divine beast. But then I remembered that I still had to build the Goron statues. Now that there was nothing else left, I finally had to actually work on these builds. After attempting a redo, I decided that the first statue was good enough, so I reworked the baby Goron a little bit and roughened up the structure to make it look more rocky. The second statue had a bigger makeover as I made the head more spherical, changed the position of the arms so that they lined up better, and changed its left arm entirely to have straighter angles and be less curved. I don't think these were as difficult as I originally thought they were. I think I was just lazy. Or stupid. Probably both. As for the Daruk statue, I never even tried to build this one up, so I was starting from scratch. I removed the outline of the original head, smoothed the structure, and began work on the left arm, which surprisingly went pretty good. This statue has a lot more detail than the others, with hair and wristbands, so I was able to make this one look a lot less bland than the other two. I started work on the other arm that's holding a large boulder, which was a little trickier than the first, but not by much. As for the head, I started with a sphere just like the others, and since it has lots of hair, it turned out a lot better than the other statues. I was actually happy with this one. After experimenting with a few different ways to color the statues, I settled on a palette that was a bit lighter than the Eldin cliffs, making them stick out a bit more. Finally, the Goron statues were complete. Turning my attention back to Rudania, I had to figure out how I was even going to build this thing. The problem with Rudania is that we had built every single divine beast in their position from before Link conquers them, so to follow that pattern with Rudania, it needs to be built crawling diagonally across the mountain. That sounds impossible, but I had an idea. If I use the handy-dandy rotate command, I might be able to build the divine beast like normal and rotate it with the command to fit the mountain. I started work on a skeletal outline for the divine beast, wanting to get a proper shape and scale down as soon as possible so that I could test the rotation. I started by outlining the main body, which took a few tries to get the right size for. The tail went by pretty fast without much struggle, so I quickly moved on to the head. With the body outline done, I rotated it by 50 degrees to fit on the mountain, and I instantly knew that this strategy was going to work. I just had to finish designing it and rotate it by the same angle. I began designing the divine beast, starting with the cylindrical base of the legs on the main body. I quickly realized that Rudania is extremely symmetrical on all sides. The 4 quadrants of the main body were all identical, and later I would find out that the base of the tail and the neck are nearly the exact same design. After the body was built up, I put in place the half-ring designs that connect together above the divine beast, having to come up with a few different styles for the spines that line the back. I moved to the underside to build the divine beast's belly, which was very simplistic and went by quite fast. That already finishes up the main body, but the tail was a little more tricky. The angle of the tail wasn't hard to figure out, but because it gets thinner near the end of the tail, it was a bit hard to get the curves down right, as the thinner end looked strange at this angle. Eventually, I solved this issue by just making the tail a bit thicker overall. The base of the tail went by pretty fast since it was just a reused asset from Va Meadow, and the rest of it had a pretty simplistic design as well, making it quite easy. This large block at the end of the tail wasn't too bad either, but it did have this semicircle thing sticking out of the end, which did take some time to get right because of the diagonal angle. As mentioned earlier, the neck design is extremely similar to the base of the tail, so it was pretty much just the head that was left to build. The first design was too big and I had to redo it, but the cone shape wasn't difficult to make and the design work was pretty straightforward as well. All that was left now was the interior. The inside of Rudania is very open with 4 rooms in the base of the legs, which made this interior one of the easiest ones yet. After figuring out some designs for the walls and floor, I built up the side rooms before finishing up the main chamber. Once it was all done, I added the diagonal bar that goes across the length of the beast, finishing up the interior. Now, you may have noticed that I skipped out on building the legs, and that's because unlike the rest of the Divine Beast, I wanted to build them after the rotation to put it onto Death Mountain. I figured they would need to be more precisely molded to the terrain of the mountain since they are the only part of the Divine Beast that will actually touch the volcano. So I finally used the rotate command and placed the Divine Beast on the mountain. There was a lot of cleanup work to do on the Divine Beast, so I decided to fix up that before building the legs. This cleanup work didn't take too long, but because of the angle in which Rudania has to sit at, the interior is less than ideal. As for the legs though, in Breath of the Wild there are a collection of different plates as seen here, so my first idea was to build these plates up and stitch them together to form a leg. But after a few attempts, it didn't really end up looking that good. So instead, I started with a thick base for the legs and added the platings around the base one at a time. This made the legs look like they had more of a structure to it and made it appear that they were actually supporting the Divine Beast. Sam was there to help out with the legs and also joined me in designing the feet, which we quickly finished up. One last touch I wanted to add to Rudania were the flames coming out from each of the feet, so I separated the foot design and built them up with the help of the loft command, before returning to the beast and putting them back in place. With that, the final Divine Beast of the project was complete. Now, for the final build of the episode, I wanted to create the plume of smoke coming out of Death Mountain. I started with a gigantic funnel shape coming from the top of the mountain before adding an outer ring of smoke around the top. However, I ended up disliking this and came to change it later. I added clumps of magma near the bottom to make it feel more fiery closer to the volcano, and made the rest into a mixture of different colored glass. Later, to make it look a bit better, I changed the top of the plume to make it fizzle out a lot more, which helped it look a lot better. In the end, I'm honestly not sure if I like the plume of smoke. I might end up redoing it or scrapping it entirely, but for now, I kept it, and Eldin was complete. In the end, this wound up being one of the most fun regions of the map to build. Maybe it's just because the end of the project was keeping me excited, but Eldin and Akkala felt different from the rest of the map, which made it a lot more interesting. Next episode will be the final building video, tackling Typhlo Ruins, Korok Forest, and Central Hyrule with the castle. After that video is released, there will be one final mega episode to cap off the series, and with it, the world download. With that all said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.